All right, so let's start. And information technology, as we know, employs a truly global workforce. We are working we are working every day with people coming from different countries, different continents. So how we can make sure that this collaboration runs smoothly, and how to manage those very diverse teams we have to work with. Maria Pastorelli, our speaker, is today with us from Shanghai, and she is going to share with us her knowledge on the topic. Maria, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you so much to everybody for being here. I'm extremely happy to be here to share my experience with you all. And as Alex mentioned, I'm going to share a little bit, and then I'm trying to make it a little bit interactive. So there will be some Mentimeter questions for you all to answer if you wish. That will give it a little bit more a flow. And also, I'm very curious to know from you. So before I start with everything, let me just go here. And I apologize in advance if there's any sharing screen hiccups. I'll do my best to make it as smooth as possible, but bear with me just in case. So this is what we're talking about today. We're talking about effective global teams management in 2021. And I know from just working in 2021 that working with other people in a virtual setting across the globe is becoming more and more the norm. And that's where we want to understand how to work with people that come from different backgrounds than we do, because that is happening more and more, and it's only going to happen even more in the future. Now, before we go into the meat of today's talk, I would just like to very briefly introduce myself. As Alex, with a fantastic Italian accent, has introduced me, I'm Maria, and I've been living in Shanghai, China for the past 11 and something years, so almost 12. I am a cross-cultural trainer, author, speaker, I'm an executive coach. I founded my consulting company, Bridge, and I'm also the founder of the Global Women Entrepreneur Network, which is a network and community for women entrepreneurs to learn and support each other. My background is I have a cross-cultural communication degree, which is where I learned most of the knowledge that I use daily in my communications with my clients and colleagues and partners across the globe. So I would like to start by showing this picture, which I always do, because I find that this is the picture that encapsulates what sometimes feels communication or just working with people from different backgrounds. It feels like we're saying two completely different things. And if we're lucky, it turns out that we are actually looking at the same thing. And the challenge is making sure that those two perspectives merge and are able to being heard. And sometimes that's easier, sometimes that is more challenging. And that's what we're looking at today. Why is it challenging? And what can we do to make it a little bit less challenging? So, because I wanted to make this a little bit more interactive, I'm going now to start from the actual challenges of global teams. And I would love for everybody to share what you are currently experiencing as a challenge. And I'm going to do that by sharing the Mentimeter. And again, please bear with me for just a second while I do this properly. Hopefully I can do this. And there it is. So hopefully now you can see a different slide. And if you go to the app or the website, you can put in that code and you can answer this question. I would really love to know from your perspective, what are some challenges that you're facing at the moment with your teams, with your clients, in your work? And then we'll take those and see what could be the reason for them, or where do they potentially come from.
And later on throughout the presentation, when you have questions, then please share the questions in the chat. I will try to ask as many questions as possible directly, and then we will address all the questions during the Q&A session.
There you go. Perfect. So I'm just going to read them out loud so that we just get a sense. So someone says, no challenges yet. Team members are local, but it will happen soon. Would assume is cultural differences and time zones. Okay, that's great. Then we have communication. English is not native language for everyone. Time zone difference. Different management cultures in different regions. All right. Then we have communication styles, organization of work, ways of confronting problems, different understanding of the same thing. No, we are one group feeling. Okay. Lack of connections. These are fantastic. Thank you all so much for sharing. Let's give it 30 more seconds if there's anyone else who wants to share. I'm sure they'll pop up. Otherwise, I can definitely sense a theme in here, which is culture, time zones. Yes, again, we just addressed it at the beginning. Time zones are challenging, especially depending on where the team is based, and differences.
And Maria,
yes.
Klaus has a question
Yes.
about what you have told earlier. What do you mean by merging of perspectives? Is it a consensus, following different perspectives, or something or other?
Right. That's a great question. Thank you, Klaus. What I meant is that sometimes we do have to get things done. And so it's not necessarily a consensus, but maybe instead of merging, let me rephrase that, finding a common point between the perspectives. So if you have to work with two teams that have a complete different viewpoint, at some point you will have to find some commonalities. It doesn't have to be a consensus on anything, on everything, sorry, but to connect and to proceed in the conversation, in the project, you will have to find some sort of middle ground, which could be 50-50, it could be more on one side or on the other side, but that's what I meant of merging. Maybe that was not the perfect word, but thank you for clarifying. Hope this helps. And if not, please feel free to ask more questions on that. All right, so here we have a few of the challenges that you're currently facing, and I am very happy to say that this transitions very nicely into what some of the ones that I found in my own work with global teams that are very similar to what you all mentioned. So communication styles are very different. Management styles, way of answering, way of responding to any kind of communication, whether that's written or voice communication. Lack of structure, that is something that also can be quite challenging depending on how the project is set up. It could be very chaotic because there is no central and physical way to deal with things. Distrust, I think someone mentioned lack of we're one group feeling that can come from distrust. And of course, because being global, relationships are a little bit harder to build online. And time zones that most of you mentioned do impact a lot of things, including response time, especially when things need to proceed. It might take longer due to time zones and reasonable, hopefully, working time. So thank you all for sharing the challenges that you have. And again, later I'll be happy to answer any other specific questions. But I wanted just to get a sense from you, from what you have experienced so far, what were the challenges. And so with these, we go into exploring a little bit what it looks like if we dig a little bit deeper and why things are the way they are. And usually when I have more time, I usually do this as an exercise, but I'm very happy to talk through it a little bit briefly. When we look at culture, culture can be seen as many things. One of the ways that we can look at culture is like looking at an iceberg. And as we all know, an iceberg is much bigger underneath the surface than it is above the surface. So if we look at the surface part, we can call it surface culture, which are all the things that we can see. Things like different food, different clothing, different languages, things that are visible to the naked eye when we go to a different culture or when we go to a different country. What we usually don't see is everything that is below the water, which we call deep culture. These are anything from unspoken rules to values to cultural reasons why people do the behaviors that we see up top. And here you can find just an example of all the things that we mean when we speak about surface culture and deep culture. The part below the water is usually quite challenging for people in the culture to explain. So I'm Italian. If you ask me, what is the reason why, I don't know, people, for example, have very deep connection to, for example, food on a Sunday. It's a very important tradition in Italy that is connected probably to family or to like the warmth that you get like from the importance of preparing food for the loved ones and to relationships and to the idea of home. And that is something that if you ask, a random stranger passing by, they might never think about it, but that is what everybody knows unconsciously. So when you deal with people that come from different cultures, and for the sake of clarity, I would like to mention that when I mean culture, the first thing that comes to mind is national culture, which means people from different countries. But of course, culture is not only national culture. It can be company culture. It can be regional culture. So the difference are multiple. And the easiest way to look at it is different countries have different cultures, but that is not the only difference. So I just wanted to mention because I get asked that a lot if it changes. So when we deal with people that come from any different culture, what we usually do as human beings, we do something that is innate to us. And we take our own perspective on things because that's what we know, and we apply it to another culture. So for example, I always give this example. For those of you who have ever been to China, and for those who have don't, now you will know. When you go to a restaurant in China, even in 2021, if it's a traditional Chinese restaurant, you ask for a glass of water. And by default, you will get a glass of hot water, of boiling water. And for everybody who just comes here from a different country, that, for example, like Italy, for me, that is very strange. Because usually in Italy, if you ask for a glass of water, you get a glass of cold water. So if I go from my perspective, I can see that as strange, as unnecessary, as weird, as why would they give me hot water? And I would go and judge that as wrong, as stupid, as this is something that is not how you do things. Of course, thinking about it, that is a completely unnecessary judgment because that's how things are done in China. If they go to a different country and they ask for a glass of water, they will expect hot water and probably they will get cold water. So the idea of understanding a little bit what is below the surface can help us diminish these assumptions and try to be a little bit more curious and understanding about why people do what they do, where these behaviors come from, so that we can understand them. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them. It doesn't mean we have to condone and justify, but it's to understand. And once we understand, we can decide what to do about it. If you're interested, this is just as a very brief aside, when we talk about culture, there's a lot of things that we mention. And for those who are familiar with the work of Hofstede, he's a researcher that did a lot of studies about culture. Usually we look at all of these dimensions when we understand what specifically are the differences. If that's of interest, I'm very happy to talk a little bit more about that later, because I don't want for this to take all of the time that we have. But things like understanding why in certain countries people are not willing to speak up in front of their boss, that might have to do with power distance. There are cultures that are more focused on an egalitarian and equality way of doing things. There are some cultures that are much more comfortable with hierarchy. And so that might be one of the reasons why people behave in a certain way. So understanding all of this is interesting and can be really helpful in dealing with people that come from a different culture. Because different cultures have different behaviors, and even the way that we communicate is very different, regardless of the language that we use. And so here is where I would like to take the second little, sorry, let me try and go back to my multimeter. There you go. Oop. There you go. So same as before. Now, if we talk about communication, I would love to know what misunderstandings, if any, have you experienced? And maybe we can link some of those to some ideas about different styles of communication. All right, and once we get everybody's feedback, I'm just reading what we have so far. So we have understanding of time and deadlines. How important and relevant are those? What is the commitment? All right. Then we have another feedback, which is team members will say they can do it, but not delivering as the task wasn't clear, and they did not speak up and clarify what needs to be done. Level of distributed work, level of leader decision, yes. Then, especially on the second one about the not speaking up or not clarifying, that will particularly be a segue in what we're about to look into. But even just the understanding of time and deadlines, that is an extremely important topic that comes up over and over and over again, because some cultures, as you saw in the slide before, have a more fluid concept of time, and some cultures have a much more fixed understanding of time. And so that alone can create misunderstandings. And then the amount of clarification and that is required increases. All right, I see a couple more coming in. So one sharing is attitude towards ambition, progress, speaking up, challenging work, or input if it comes from someone hierarchically superior. All right. And another sharing is disagreeing with leadership. All right. Thank you all for sharing. This is really, really valuable. And it's interesting to see that even though we do work in very different environments, the challenges that we face and the misunderstandings that happen are from common situations. And so, which means that in the end, we're all people, and we just can try to see how we can work together, regardless of what industry or what background we have, just making sure that we understand each other. So if there's no more sharings, I will go back to the other slides. If you have anything else, please feel free to just type it in the chat. I'm very happy to get more feedback on this. I just want to make sure that we also go to the slides. So with that, I would like to go into a very, very, very short and hopefully eye-opening sharing about global communication. Because, and again, this could take a lot longer, but I'm trying to make it as relevant as possible. Very, very broadly speaking, there's two ways that people communicate. And one way is called low context, and one way is called high context. This is a very old infographic, so it's not the best quality, but hopefully it's clear enough. And cultures, national cultures, usually divide themselves into these two groups. A few cultures are preferring a low context approach. As you can see, it's focused on words, gestures, and tone. And some cultures are more focused on high context communication, which means taking a lot more things into consideration. to give even more specific details, high context cultures are very focused on the context, which means that where you are, who you're speaking with, and what is the situation is very, very important to understand what is being said. There's a lot of indirectness and ambiguity. The need for reading between the lines is very, very important in a high context culture. In Japan, they call it reading the air, which means understanding the situation and understanding from that what is actually being said. That's why it's very focused on nonverbal signs and also on how people say things, not just what they say. On the other side, low context communication cultures are very focused on the task, very task oriented. What is being said is what is being said. There's no ambiguity, there's very direct, very explicit. And as you can imagine, from a low context perspective, a high context communication can be seen as very manipulative or uncertain, or I heard even sometimes flat out lying, because they say they could do it, they didn't do it, they were lying to me. And you will now see why I have a lot of experience with this, because this is a very broad and again, a little bit generalized distribution of where national cultures stand in the low and high context scale. Later, I'm very happy to see because we have people from all around the world, I'm very happy to see if you recognize yourself into this. As you can see, Italy is slightly in the middle, a little bit towards high context. I'm an Italian working in China. You can see that the difference is quite big. I also work with a lot of companies that are from the Nordics, so Sweden and Denmark, and that are very interesting conversations, because from a North European perspective, it's very much low context directiveness. Working with China, which is a very high context culture where indirectness and harmony is very important, can cause a lot of misunderstandings. And all of them are resolvable if we understand that this is a difference and how we can then work through it. A few things that are behaviors that specifically embody these differences are usually the way to say no. There's a saying that, at least in a lot of high context communication, there's 1,000 ways to say no, and one of them is yes. Smiling can have a lot of different meanings, and we usually understand smiling as being happy, but at least in Asia, in my experience, especially even in China, even in Thailand, a lot can be said with a smile, and a lot of the times is not necessarily a positive and happy feeling. And last but not least, silence can be used in extremely powerful ways by using that as an extremely polite way to disagree or saying no. And that often happens, at least in a lot of high context culture like China, where if a question is posed to the whole group, many times, especially from Europeans and Americans, if they pose a question to a big audience, it's likely that nobody will speak up. And silence is an answer in itself. Before we go to global practices, also, I want to be mindful of time. Alex, I just want to make sure how much time we have left, and if people have any questions so far.
So we do have 30 minutes left, and from those 30 minutes, we will take some for the Q&A and also for the open discussion. So we are good in time.
Perfect, just making sure. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please do feel free to write them in the chat. I'm extremely happy to answer any of those. In the meantime, I would like to share some of the things that I personally found very, very beneficial when working across the globe. Personally, I work mostly in China, but I work with Asia and Europe a lot. And regardless of high context and low context, I feel that there are some best practices that work when dealing with groups of diverse colleagues and diverse peers. So the first one that I would like to share, and this is particularly true if you are dealing with a high context culture, because that can be quite a shock. Of course, if you want to praise and celebrate successes, that can be done in public, and that is absolutely welcome. However, criticizing and giving constructive feedback, it doesn't matter how well it's delivered. In a lot of countries, and again, here, especially in Asian cultures, it is seen as extremely disrespectful because it's seen as damaging someone's reputation. So if there's feedback to be given, it is preferred to give in private in order to avoid this losing face phenomenon. So that's just in general. And when dealing with a global team, there are a few opportunities where if this is done, that can impact the willingness or the team spirit, but also can have can create a little bit of a break between the team and the leader. So that is something that I personally have done unknowingly in my first year here in China, and I have caused someone to quit their job. So I say that as a personal experience. Criticize in private. That's always a more constructive way to do that. When we're talking about engagement, this is something that as a speaker and trainer and coach, I do as a job, but I find that a lot of managers as well are trying to get their teams to work together. And coming from a European perspective, it is much more normal and much more common to go into a meeting room and just ask everybody for their input and say, okay, you tell me what's wrong, or like, just let me know what you all think. And that is an approach that can work if people are used to that. But in a lot of places, especially in cultures that have a more high context approach, speaking out, especially in front of the boss, especially about things that they might not be 100% sure of, it is considered risky because the fear of making a mistake can impact their willingness to speak out. And because if they make a mistake, they will lose face and that will impact their reputation and so on. So another best practice is when needed to share information, then there's no problem in addressing everybody. But when you need input, so when you need questions or when you need ideas, if asking a big group doesn't really work, try to divide people into small groups, have them discuss between themselves, and then report back to the big groups. Online, it's perfectly doable with Zoom. You can have breakout rooms and then get everybody back into plenary. If you are working physically, you can just divide people. If you give them a flip chart, it's even better because they can write things down. And in my experience, I found that this, especially in China, works particularly well because people get to first have a smaller group where they can test out ideas and it doesn't feel as scary as sharing it with the bigger group. But it's even more powerful because when someone from the small group is appointed a spokesperson, they get to say, we think that our group has this idea, which lowers the risk of failure or the risk of saying something that it's not 100% correct. It shares responsibility. And so people feel much more willing to do that instead of just saying, I think that. When dealing with clarifying, and I know that someone was mentioning that before, and I was very happy to see that because that happens all the time. In my experience with the people I work with and with the managers and executives that I coach to be able to work with their team, sometimes they say, well, I told them, that was very clear. I asked if it was okay. Everybody said yes. and then nothing got done. And that happens very, very often, because again, in some cultures, it's very, especially in the low context cultures, it's very okay to challenge the leadership. It's very okay to ask questions. In other cultures, like generally speaking, Asia and high context cultures, that is very, very uncomfortable, because a hierarchical structure makes it that the leader is never challenged because of the risk I mentioned before. So if you ask, is it clear? People will say yes. That yes, as frustratingly as it can be, that can be a yes, I hear you. Yes, I'm listening right now. Not necessarily a yes, I understand, or yes, I will do it. Because maybe there's other things to clarify that are not they're not okay to be said in that particular situation. So a way around that is, instead of saying, is everything clear? I often use, what are your next steps? How can you make that happen by so-and-so? What support do you need from me to make this happen? That open question is an invitation for a further discussion where people will feel a little bit more comfortable sharing if there's any question that comes up, or if there's any obstacles they can foresee, instead of just taking the yes or no question. In order to then make sure that things are actually being done, again, in low context cultures, it is much more normal to just leave a lot more room for people to operate. But in high context cultures, micromanaging and following really closely what people have said, especially from a leadership position, is very expected. So sometimes without follow-up, things can fall through the crack. And so teams are expecting their leaders to follow up, especially on one-on-one, just to make sure that everyone is doing well. And if they have any questions, they can bring them up again in a much more psychologically safe and lower risk situation. Don't get me wrong, from personal experience, I know that this takes more time. Yes, it does. But sometimes spending a little bit more time on this can allow the team to work so much better in the longer run. Sorry, my mouse just got, all right. And last but not least, I would like to share one more, which is just about leadership. As we said, working in global teams, it can feel a little bit isolating. So especially online, creating relationship is extremely important. And it is very different from working face-to-face, because those maybe informal moments have to be created. There's no water cooler to all go at a break time. So those have to be consciously created. So I work with a lot of teams that just create maybe a Monday night, half an hour social Zoom call, just to not talk about work, but just to get to know each other. And that's just one example, but even like creating more one-on-one relationships can be also very beneficial. On the other side, if you're working with cultures where hierarchy is very important, respecting the roles and being very clear on what people are expected to do can be extremely beneficial, because giving a lot of autonomy can create chaos and can make people very uncomfortable. So in my experience, especially with China, respecting and being clear about what are people expected to do can make a very big difference into actually having a team that works well together. To start. Then, of course, things can be flexed. And as we said at the beginning, the two perspectives, there's no right or wrong, but there's a way to adapt one way or the other, depending on what the situation calls for. One more thing that I wanted to mention is that this is something that sometimes happens, because misunderstandings can sometimes go into conflicts. And this is less to do with culture, but it's more to do with approaches. And generally speaking, let's say high context culture have a much more accommodating and avoiding ways of managing conflicts. because, again, very generally speaking, being a more indirect way to communicate makes it that the assertiveness is quite low. Low context culture, which are much more direct, generally speaking, people do prefer a more direct approach. So there will be a little bit more of collaborating, maybe even competing, depending on how cooperative people are. And compromising can always be an option. But just being aware that people deal with conflicts in very different ways can help to see what is a way to resolve them. Last but not least, I wanted to share a particular approach about goal setting, because if you work with teams, you do want to make sure you understand what happens, but also once you have, you do want people to then go and execute whatever they want to, whatever they need to do. So when it's personal, it is important to be very flexible and planning for contingencies, because working with diverse teams can be challenging, and especially in a virtual environment and with all the changes that we're going through recently, make sure that having a lot of flexibility can be very, very important. And when we talk about a team, I personally think that sharing details and sharing why and getting consensus, which we can do with the best practices that I've shared, can be very beneficial, because that can make sure that everybody's on the same page. And sometimes that can take a little bit longer, but it definitely helps with the long-term success of the team. I have just one more slide, which is something that I have created for my clients, and I'm very happy to share with everybody, which is called the Clarity Map, which is personally what I use when I set goals for me and the people I work with. And it's basically a coaching approach to how to figure something out. So I'll be happy to share with everybody. You can get that at the link. That is what I use to keep my productivity up when I'm facing a challenge, and it can be very flexible. So you can use it to try and figure out what is a potential misunderstanding with your team, or if you feel that there's something that really is not working, and where does that come from, and what is the goal that you want to achieve, and how are you going to achieve it. So how are we doing with time? And I am pretty much done with the content I was planning. I'm very happy to take any questions or defer to Alex for.
Thank you very much, Maria, for all the insights shared, and thank you for sharing the Clarity Map canvas. We do have the question. From Tanya about what's the best approach for a UK team to work with the Asian-based team. Tanya wrote that you already answered partially this question with some of the tips. However, maybe you would like to add something up, and I would suggest us maybe to take this question and afterwards disable the recording and move on to a discussion.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. Tanya, yes, thank you for the question. And that is exactly what I was mentioning, because most of the time, Europeans working with Asia, that is where and Asians working with Europeans, and I work with both of them on two sides, sometimes that is quite challenging. So particularly working with Asian-based team, be very aware of the concept of face, which is losing face, means anything that is damaging someone's reputation can be seen as quite distressing. So like giving feedback in public, that would be very, very, a very big reason for someone to lose face. Anything that is said about the team getting into small groups, absolutely that works. Being aware that a high context communication, like most cultures in Asia, again, there's different ways to say no, different ways to use silence, which doesn't necessarily mean that people are didn't understand. It's just they're using that to send a message, which means I'm not comfortable about saying this at the moment. I would like to maybe share that in private later. So that would be my top tip, is a lot of one-on-ones communication that can help with understanding. And bonus tip, if you can, And this requires a little bit of practice in creating relationship. If you can't, find yourself what a colleague of mine calls a cultural informant, which means if you have a good relationship with someone from the culture that you're trying to work with, do maybe with time ask them, what is normal in the way that you do things? What do you normally do? What do you usually do? What does this usually mean? In that case, you will get more and more information from them, and it will be less assumptions, and you will actually get the ways that they are used to do things. And it doesn't mean that you have to adapt 100%, but getting that information can be very, very valuable to know how to deal with certain situations.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you, everyone, for your questions and your participation. I will stop the recording now and invite you to enable your cameras and microphones and ask your questions to Maria directly.